The book of Numbers, chapter 1, verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tabernacle of meeting, on the first day of the second month, in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying. Exactly 1 month after the tabernacle is set up, God speaks to Moses from that tabernacle. Verse 2, God says, "Take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel, by their families, by their fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male individually." God is a God of order. The Israeli army had to be organized. You know, the Jews did not march through the wilderness in a haphazard fashion. God did not call them to do that. He's a God of order. And when they marched through that wilderness, it may have looked like chaos to the casual observer. But they marched with every single family in its proper place, and God had a proper place for each one of them. And they were carefully arranged. They were a carefully arranged civil organization. Leads me to say this: God is not the author of confusion. He doesn't lead in a random, aimless way. So if Israel's going to be organized, and God wants them to be organized, there needed to be a census. And we'll see why in a second. Look at verse 3. From 20 years old and above, all who are able to go to war in Israel, you and Aaron shall number them by their armies. Well, we see that the census had a military purpose as well. It wasn't just for the sake of organizing the Israelites according to their families, but it had a military purpose. You see, Israel was going to have some run-ins with many enemies. And, of course, God had promised them victory if they remained faithful to Him. But that didn't mean that they could just sit back and be a nation of pacifists. God expected them to prepare themselves by having an army. You know, there's no room for presumption among the children of God. We need to be careful not to take God for granted. God has never promised to bless carelessness. He has never promised to bless indifference. And He commands that the Israelites be counted for the sake of their army, as well as for the sake of their family lines. Look at verse 4. "And with you there shall be a man from every tribe, each one the head of his father's house." So God says there's to be one person from each tribe. They are to assist Moses and Aaron in taking their census. Verse 5. "These are the names of the men who shall stand with you." Now, I'm not going to read verses 5 through 17. I'll just say that these are the names of the individuals that God chose to represent each tribe to help Moses and Aaron take this census. I do want to say this. To me, it's an amazing thing. You know, there was likely 2 to 3 million Israelites in the desert at that time, in the Mount Sinai area. 2 to 3 million Israelites. And out of all those people, God handpicked one representative from each tribe to assist Moses. He handpicked one. Yeah, I am thankful that God cares about big things, like keeping the planets from crashing together, keeping the earth spinning on its axis. I'm glad that He cares about the big things, like keeping the sun shining and keeping the oceans from drowning out the land. I'm glad He cares about those big, important things. But He also cares for each one of us as individuals. He notices each one of us, and He cares for us individually. Look at this. God knew exactly who was right for this job, and He handpicked these 12 guys. Look at verse 18. And they assembled all the congregation together on the first day of the second month, and they recited their ancestry by families, by their fathers' houses, according to the number of names from 20 years old and above, each one individually. Some of us might say, well, what's the big deal? What difference does it make what family they came from or who their ancestors are? You know, what's the big deal? Why don't you just count them all? It's a lot faster, isn't it? Why do you have to break them down to each individual family, each individual tribe out of the 12 tribes in the nation Israel? Why? Doesn't seem to make sense probably to most of us. But to the Jews, knowledge of one's ancestors was critical. A Jew's lineage determined his property. Because remember, the land was to be handed down from generation to generation and remain in the family. But in addition to that, later on we're going to see that a prophet will predict that the Messiah will come from the line of Judah. God chose the line of Judah to be the ancestry of the Messiah, and that's where Jesus came from. So you see, if the Jews can't prove their lineage, that means Jesus would not be able to trace his lineage, which means that he can't claim the throne of David, which was the kingly line, which means that the prophecy is worthless. So it is very important that people remained in their family and understood who their ancestors were. Let's skip down to verse 46. Skip all these names. In verse 46 of Numbers chapter 1, says, all who were numbered were 603,550. Now remember this. These 600,000 plus Israelites were just the fighting men over the age of 20. You add to those 600,000 the women, the men under the age of 20, the boys and girls, and then you've got at least 2 to 3 million people in total. Verse 47. But the Levites were not numbered among them by their fathers' tribe. So the census included everybody except the tribe of the Levites. And here's why, verse 48. For the Lord had spoken to Moses, saying, only the tribe of Levi you shall not number, nor take a census of them among the children of Israel. But you shall appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony, over all its furnishings, and over all things that belong to it. They shall carry the tabernacle and all its furnishings. They shall attend to it, and camp around the tabernacle. And when the tabernacle is to go forward, the Levites shall take it down. And when the tabernacle is to be set up, the Levites shall set it up. The outsider who comes near shall be put to death. The children of Israel shall pitch their tents, every one by his own camp, every one by his own standard, according to their armies. But the Levites shall camp around the tabernacle of the testimony, that there may be no wrath on the congregation of the children of Israel. And the Levites shall keep charge of the tabernacle of the testimony. Thus the children of Israel did. According to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so they did. The Levites were descendants of Jacob's son Levi. They had a religious deferment from the military. And as a result, they were not included in this general census. The Levites were the priests, and they also were in charge of the tabernacle. They set it up, they took it down, and they moved it. Let's go into chapter 2 of the book of Numbers. And as we come to this chapter, let me just say that in this chapter we're going to see the God-ordained arrangement of the Israeli camp. I said this before, but it's worth repeating. The Holy Spirit is not associated with confusion and disorderliness. He just is not. Some people think if you plan anything in advance, you quench the Holy Spirit. Not so. I mean, there should be room for spontaneity in the worship of God and in our worship services and just in your life in general. Shouldn't be tied down to a plan. But God works through plans also. And as we will see in this chapter, He had definite plans for Israel's encampments. Look at verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Every one of the children of Israel shall camp by his own standard, beside the emblems of his father's house. They shall camp some distance from the tabernacle of meeting. On the east side, toward the rising of the sun, those of the standard of the forces with Judah shall camp according to their armies. And Nahshon, the son of Amminadab, shall be the leader of the children of Judah. And his army was numbered at 74,600. Now, I'm not going to read verses 5 through 9 at this point, because again, you just see a lot of numbers and a lot of names associated with the tribe of Judah and the tribes that would go along with their encampment. I'll just say this, that the tabernacle was right in the center of camp. And immediately surrounding the tabernacle were the Levites. They were camped right alongside the tabernacle, surrounding the tabernacle. The remaining tribes then were gathered into 4 groups, 3 tribes per group. One group camped on each of the 4 sides of the tabernacle. So you got the tabernacle in the middle, you got the Levites camped around the tabernacle, and then you've got 3 tribes in 4 groups camped on the 4 sides of the tabernacle. And God talked about a standard here. A standard was a symbolic flag. And that standard was a symbolic flag that identified each group. Remember, within each group, there were how many tribes? 3 tribes. 3 tribes per group, 4 groups. 3 times 4 equals 12 tribes. So there's 3 tribes in 4 groups. There was a standard, a flag, that identified each group. Then, within each of the groups, every tribe had its own banner. And group number 1 was camped on the east side of the tabernacle. It included the tribes of Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Look at verse 10. On the south side shall be the standard of the forces with Reuben, according to their armies. And the leader of the children of Reuben shall be Elizur, the son of Shedeur. Well, I'm not going to read verses 11 through 17 because, again, we have a list of names that encamped under the standard of Reuben. But let me just say that this was on the south side. So on the south side of the tabernacle was the Reuben group. This second group contained the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. Now, when it was time to move out, they moved out in an orderly fashion as well. They didn't all just get up at one time, all 3 million Israelites. They didn't all just get up at one time and go anytime they pleased. No, not at all. Very orderly. When it was time to move out, Judah's group went first. They were followed by Reuben. And then following Reuben were the Levites, who of course carried the tabernacle complex. Then there was a third division, or a third group, So far you've had what? You've had Judah, you've had Reuben. There's a third group given in verse 18. Look at it. On the west side shall be the standard for the forces of Ephraim. So there's the Ephraim group, according to their armies. And the leader of the children of Ephraim shall be Elishama, the son of Amminadab. Let's stop there for a second, because I'm not going to read verses 19 through 24 for the same reasons I didn't read the other verses. A lot of names. You want to read them? Good. But we're not going to spend time doing that here. Let me just say that in this group, there were 3 more tribes. Following the Levites on the journeys was the Ephraim division. So, when it was time to move out, Judah's group went first. They were followed by Reuben, and following Reuben were the Levites. Following the Levites on their journeys was the Ephraim division. Notice how they all left at the proper time. And this Ephraim division, as I said, consisted of 3 other tribes, or 2 other tribes. This group consisted of Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And they camped on the west side of the tabernacle. So we've got 3 sides covered. Let's look at verse 25. The standard of the forces with Dan shall be on the north side, according to their armies. And the leader of the children of Dan shall be Ahiezer, the son of Ammishaddai. To the north was the camp of Dan. Now along with them were the 2 tribes Asher and Naphtali. There's a system to the way these tribes are grouped. Even the way they were categorized, even the tribes that God put together in each individual group had a purpose. There was a reason for gathering them together, categorizing them the way He did. Jacob's 12 sons, these 12 tribes descended from 12 sons. And those 12 sons came from 4 different mothers, if you remember our study in the book of Genesis. And with the exception of the tribe of Asher, the tribes are grouped according to their motherly origins. Let's go into chapter 3. Look at verse 1. Now these are the records of Aaron and Moses, when the Lord spoke with Moses on Mount Sinai. And these are the names of the sons of Aaron: Nadab, the firstborn, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. These are the names of the sons of Aaron, the anointed priests, whom he consecrated to minister as priests. Nadab and Abihu had died before the Lord when they offered profane fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai, and they had no children. So Eleazar and Ithamar ministered as priests under the oversight of Aaron, their father. Aaron, the brother of Moses, was high priest. His 4 sons were to help him and succeed him in that high and holy office. But his 2 oldest sons, Nadab and Abihu, were struck dead for disobeying God. As a result, only Eleazar and Ithamar were left to minister with their father. By the way, only the direct descendants of Aaron could serve as the priests. Look at verse 5. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Bring the tribe of Levi near, and present them before Aaron the priest, that they may serve him. And they shall attend to his needs and the needs of the whole congregation before the tabernacle of meeting, to do the work of the tabernacle. Also they shall attend to all the furnishings of the tabernacle of meeting, and to the needs of the children of Israel, to do the work of the tabernacle. And you shall give the Levites to Aaron and his sons. They are given entirely to him from among the children of Israel. So you shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall attend to their priesthood. But the outsider who comes near shall be put to death. Well, that's the second time God had mentioned that. No outsiders are to come near that temple complex. And it was the job of Aaron and his sons, the other priests, and the whole tribe of Levi to protect that sanctuary, to guard it. Aaron was from the tribe of Levi. But as I said, only Aaron's direct descendants could be priests. The rest of the Levites took care of the other religious activities. It was their job to care for the tabernacle. It was their job to carry the tabernacle when it was time to move out. Verse 11. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Now behold, I myself have taken the Levites from among the children of Israel, instead of every firstborn who opens the womb among the children of Israel. Therefore the Levites shall be mine, because all the firstborn are mine. On the day that I struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I sanctified to myself all the firstborn in Israel, both man and beast. They shall be mine. I am the Lord. Well, you remember from our study in Exodus, almost everybody, I think, knows the story of how God spared the firstborn children and the animals of the Israelites during that final plague in Egypt. He spared the firstborn. As a result, He claimed all the firstborn in Israel for Himself. However, God now exercises His divine right by substituting the firstborn, whom He claimed for Himself that day. He substitutes those firstborn for the entire tribe of Levi. Now, He's going to talk more about this in verses 40 through 51. Let's look at verse 14. Then the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, saying, Number the children of Levi by their fathers' houses, by their families. You shall number every male from a month old and above. So Moses numbered them according to the word of the Lord, as he was commanded. I'm going to skip verses 17 through 26 and just tell you what it was about. Briefly summarize it by saying, all the male Levites, a month old or more, were numbered. And they were then divided according to their association with one of the three sons of Levi. Levi had 3 sons. And since that was the case, all the Levites from a month old, all the male Levites from a month old and older, were divided into 3 groups, each one of the groups representing one of the 3 sons of Levi. His sons' names were Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The Gershonites camped on the west side of the tabernacle. Each one of these sons and the families that descended from them, they all had their own job to do regarding the tabernacle. The Gershonites, that son of Levi, they camped on the west side of the tabernacle. They were responsible for the tabernacle's cloths. They were responsible for the tabernacle's hides and the curtains. And then when we look at verse 27, I'm not going to read verses 27 through 32. It talks about the second group of Levites. The first group belonged to the son of Levi, Gershon. The second group of Levites were the Kohathites, the sons of Kohath. They camped on the south side. They were responsible for work in the tabernacle as well. Their responsibility was to care for the holy things, which were situated inside of the tabernacle. Then in verses 33 through 37, we see another group of Levites, the third group, the Merarites. They were the children of Merari. They had a job to do. They camped on the north side of the tabernacle. It was their job to care for the tabernacle's wooden framework. So you see, each one of these three sons, with all of their descendants, took care of all the work, all the work that was involved in setting up the tabernacle and taking it down when it was time to move, and carrying the tabernacle was divided to the three sons of Levi and their ancestors. Look at verse 38. Moreover, those who were to camp before the tabernacle on the east, before the tabernacle of meeting, were Moses, Aaron, and his sons, keeping charge of the sanctuary to meet the needs of the children of Israel. But the outsider who came near was to be put to death. Now that's the third time God said that. You think He's trying to get a message across to people? Listen, if you're not one of His children, then you don't belong in His presence. If you're not a part of His covenant, then you don't belong in His presence, and He doesn't want you near Him. And today, we become a part of His family through the covenant of blood that was made by Jesus Christ. He said during the Last Supper, when He instituted the Last Supper, He said, He lifted up the wine and He said, "This is my blood, the blood of the new covenant, which is shed for you, shed for the remission of the sins of the world." So if you want to be in His covenant, in covenant with God, and have the privilege of approaching His presence, then you have to have a relationship with Him through Jesus Christ. But here in verse 38 we see that Moses, along with Aaron and his sons, camped on the east side of the tabernacle. Their job was to supervise everything connected with the tabernacle. They supervised the Levites and made sure that everything was operating right on schedule and according to plan. Look at verse 40. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Number all the firstborn males of the children of Israel from a month old and above, and take the number of their names. And you shall take the Levites for me. I am the Lord, instead of all the firstborn among the children of Israel, and the livestock of the Levites instead of all the firstborn among the livestock of the children of Israel." So Moses numbered all the firstborn among the children of Israel, as the Lord commanded him. And all the firstborn males, according to the number of names from a month old and above, of those who were numbered of them, were 22,273. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the Levites instead of all the firstborn among the children of Israel, and the livestock of the Levites instead of their livestock. The Levites shall be mine. I am the Lord. And for the redemption of the 273 of the firstborn of the children of Israel, who are more than the number of the Levites, you shall take 5 shekels for each one individually. You shall take them in the currency of the shekel of the sanctuary, the shekel of 20 gerahs. And you shall give the money, with which the excess number of them is redeemed, to Aaron and his sons." So Moses took the redemption money from those who were over and above those who were redeemed by the Levites. From the firstborn of the children of Israel he took the money, 1,365 shekels, according to the shekel of the sanctuary. And Moses gave their redemption money to Aaron and his sons, according to the word of the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses. Now remember what happened here. Remember, in exchange for sparing Israel's firstborn in Egypt, God did what? Remember? He claimed them for Himself. He claimed all the firstborn in every tribe of Israel for Himself because He spared the firstborn. Now, obviously, God did not believe in human sacrificing. In fact, He condemned that. God didn't want them sacrificed to Him. That's not what He meant when He said, "I claim the firstborn for myself." He didn't want them sacrificed, but they were to be set apart for His service. Then, right here, we see that God exercised His right of substitution. He redeemed the firstborn from his service in exchange for the entire tribe of Levi. But there's a problem here. There were 273 more firstborn in all the tribes of Israel. 273 more firstborn than there were Levites. That meant that in a head-to-head exchange, firstborn for Levites, there were still 273 firstborn who needed to be redeemed. You see what's going on here? God had claimed all the firstborn in Israel for himself because he spared the firstborn down in the land of Egypt. Now he changed his mind and he said, well, instead of taking the firstborn from every family and every tribe, I'll just claim one entire tribe and exchange firstborn for Levi. Firstborn for Levi. Well, that's fine. It went well. But there was a problem. Because there were 273 more firstborn than there were Levites. So, as I said, there were still 273 firstborn who needed to be substituted for. Needed to be redeemed, in other words. God had a plan. He simply required that 5 shekels of silver for each of those 273 firstborn who did not have a match from the tribe of Levi to be paid to Aaron for the tabernacle ministry. So that's what happened. 5 shekels of silver, by the way, is the amount valued for somebody a month old and over. We saw that back in the book of Leviticus. So God has now claimed the tribe of Levi for himself. Now let's go into chapter 4, see what happens. Verse 1 says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Take a census of the sons of Kohath from among the children of Levi, by their families, by their father's house, from 30 years old and above, even to 50 years old, all who enter the service to do the work in the tabernacle of meeting. The Kohathites took care of all the tabernacle furniture, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, there were a lot of young Levites, and they could do various jobs connected with the tabernacle. And really, when you were a Levite, you were called to do something. And young Levites, as I said, could do various jobs connected with the tabernacle. But the minimum age for transporting tabernacle items was the age of 30. Look at verse 4. This is the service of the sons of Kohath in the tabernacle of meeting, relating to the most holy things. Now, I'm not going to read verses 5 through 20, but let me just summarize them for you. Aaron the priest and his sons had the job of covering all the tabernacle's holy objects. That was their job. They also placed carrying staffs through the side rings of the furniture. We looked at that in the book of Leviticus. After Aaron the priest and his sons, after they had everything all set, everything's all covered, the carrying poles are all in the furniture, everything's all set to go, the rest of the Levitical Kohathites were in charge of moving these holy items. And God made it very clear, didn't He? Very clear that they were to be careful not to touch any of those furnishings. If they do, they die. And the reason I emphasize that at this point is because later on we're going to see that that's exactly what happened. And we're going to see that God, once again, is a God who means business, and He's a God of justice. What He says He will do, He will do. When He gives a warning, He will follow through on that if that warning is not heeded. Now, look at verse 21 of Numbers chapter 4. Verses 21 and 22. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Also take a census of the sons of Gershon, by their father's house, by their families. And of course now, Gershon, he's the second son of Levi. Remember, there were 3 sons of Levi. The sons' names were Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The Kohathites took care of the tabernacle furniture. The Kohathites moved the tabernacle furniture. The second group of Levitical sons were the Gershonites, sons of Gershon. They were given the job of moving the non-wooden parts of the tabernacle. They transported the coverings. They transported the curtains and the ropes. Skipping on down now to verse 29. Look at that, and we'll see the third group of Levites. As for the sons of Merari, you shall number them by their families and by their father's house. And I'm not going to read verses 30 through 33, which talk about the Merarites. But let me just say this, that the Levitical Merarites were given the job of transporting the wooden and metal portions of the tabernacle. So each one of these three sons and their descendants had a specific job to do regarding the tabernacle. Let's look at verse 34. Actually, I'm not going to read verses 34 through 49. I'll just summarize them by saying there were 8,580 Levites involved in the work of the tabernacle. Well, we'll pick up our study next time in Numbers chapter 5.